Good afternoon, everybody from Europe, and good morning to those of you in the United States, and a really very early good morning if you happen to be in Hawaii or Alaska or the Pacific. Welcome to a joint presentation of the Rhein-Main, Kaiserslautern, UK posts of challenges of estimating and managing design and construction cost risks in Europe. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping announcements. The presentations are available on all the post websites. You'll see the link here. The session is being recorded and it'll be posted to the post websites and YouTube channels later on in the week. And you can look in the chat also for the links. Please switch off your camera and keep your microphones muted until the question and answer session. And if you have questions as we go along, just post them to the chat. Sharice we'll be monitoring the chat and we'll try to answer questions as we go. Next slide, please. So on to introductions. We're going to have a short presentation by each of the post presidents or their representatives if they have not made it on their own. So we'll start with the Rhein-Main post first. Oh, somebody has a hot mic. Hot mic with kids.
Cool.
Hello, hot mic with kids. Okay. Passing it off to Sharice Knotts, who will be representing the Rhein-Main post. You're on mute, Sharice.
Thank you for that, Al. Greetings to everyone from Scott Churigan, the 2022 Rhein-Main Post President, who unfortunately could not join us today. Our Post Vice President is Justin Weatherwax, the Deputy District Engineer of the Corps of Engineers. He also, unfortunately, was not able to join us. I am the past Post President and the Post Fellow. So a few of the priorities for the Rhein-Main Post are industry government engagement that improve our collaboration work efforts. We want to continue the tech talks that advance our engineering and management knowledge. And we want to have fun events that offer networking and build solidarity between our post members, and then support to initiatives for STEM and SAME young professionals that foster our community's emerging engineers. We're open to any interests or suggestions that I have for our post, and there's our email address at the bottom of the slide. I'd also like to take just a moment to recognize our sustaining members for the Rhein-Main Post, and thank you for your support.
Okay, next slide, please. So Colonel Scott
Hi.
Matthews, I don't believe has joined us today, so I'll turn it over to Jen Rigo, who's Civilian Vice President of the Kaiserslautern Post.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. So I'm the Civilian Vice President of the Post, also representing Major Seth Polson, who is the Military Vice President, and Colonel Scott Matthews, who couldn't be here today. We did a survey and polled and talked to our members at the beginning of this year, and we came up with 3 post goals. They're shown here in front of you, which is the #1 goal for our post this year is learning new material and professional development. And #2 that's important to our members is networking with others in the industry. And #3 is STEM and school outreach and our STEM scholarship program, which is well underway. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or one of the other board members, and we'd be happy to bring you onto our team. Thanks. Next slide.
Okay, snapshot of the Kaiserslautern Post sustaining members. Thanks, Jen. And our last presentation for the UK Post, if you go to the next slide, please, will be Major Jet Sedora calling in from Lakenheath. Over to you, Jet.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, hey, that was a sweet picture of Seth Paulson. I haven't seen that beautiful face in a minute. So I'm not saying anything new that you guys haven't seen in the previous two slides, but just kind of reiterate and re-emphasize that the last couple of years have been funny in the sense that we've had to adjust to this new normal. And so trying to go back to the former normal in the sense that we want to get back into in-person activities and engagement. And so in doing so, hopefully we increase our membership here at the Post. And then lastly, tied with that is how do we increase those membership is that we get them engaged and recognized at the appropriate levels. Thanks.
All right, next slide, please. Thanks, Jet. I guess before we go on, I should introduce myself too. I forgot to do that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Al Lucht. I'm the European Regional Vice President for SAMI. This is my second year of tenure. I'll be turning the reins over to Chris Knudsen at the JETC in May in Aurora, Colorado. So on to our presentations for today, and just a reminder for each of the speakers, if you introduce yourself. And so our first speaker today is going to be Patty Bolton from the North Atlantic Division Corps of Engineers. Over to you, Patty.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having invited me, not just myself, but also Will Daly. The purpose here for the briefing that we have is to show you our project authorization development process and how that has progressed from what it had been roughly 10 years ago to where we are now in developing our project authorizations. So I'd like to introduce myself first for very briefly. I was probably about, well, way too long ago, an Army officer for about 10 years, left and started working with a design build. I did that for about another 10 years. And for the last 13, I've been with the Corps of Engineers as a design manager, PM, resident engineer, and cost engineer. And now currently work at North Atlantic Division as a regional specialist for cost, design, and value engineering. I'm sure Will introduce himself, but I think he's already well-versed with your group. So next slide. So prior development for the projects, they're currently and still are always built upon directives. And in the prior years, it was based more on a parametric basis. And that came from a historical database that we had. Normally, it was on a 5 to 15% project design completion. And so both the scope and the cost were relatively parametric and based on, with that, specific facilities that had guidance unit cost. Beginning in 2013, there was a slight progression for projects to progress to, instead of the Code 3 process, the Code 2. And using the Code 2, they were able to say that we wanted to have the projects more of a 35% design as a basis for developing PAs. And frankly, that truly happened just with a couple of projects that they started issuing those. So I'm not saying that the current process happened then, or our current process is only in the last few years, but at that time frame, there was a larger push to develop a better PA. Now, this would have happened also on some projects where these projects were unique or special. But now it has moved to some of the other standard designs. Next slide. So here you can see our current FY24 Army MILCON process for the Code 2. All the MILCON projects are now progressing through this Code 2 process. We understand that it's a relatively compressed timeline and that this is particularly only for the Army. Right now our deadline is 1 July to have these complete packages, which would include, if you see in the middle, a 35% design submission, a certification package, also a DCA assessment, and it's an assessment of the project and where it is in terms of the design deliverables in relation to cost. So there's two separate things happening here. The 35% in the Code 2 is one thing, and then this DCA assessment is another. But they work hand in hand. What I'd like to highlight here is that all of the project, we have different project sponsors as listed below, DECA, DIA, DISA, SOCOM, you name it. And they all have different timelines that they work with. This is in particular only the Army timeline. Next slide. So as you can see here, there's been, we have had and have been for a long time, the DCA. This DoD directive came out and it reinvigorated the same thing, that who the DCAs are for different areas and their responsibilities, and also the UFC and UFCGS to the greatest extent possible. Those are the two significant things that came out of that. But in 17 March of 2020, the USD Lord memo came out, highlighting new requirements for military construction budget estimate requirements. This is from DoD, and it requires, and that's everything that goes to DoD, which would include those project sponsors on the prior slide. The purpose of this was to assess all the projects in terms of their design deliverables with the purpose and intent to inform the classification of estimate that was being provided. So hopefully, along with a 35% design, you would also have a class 3 estimate. And the focus was to reduce the risk of underfunded projects as highlighted here. So now, in order to implement that, USACE is taking a look at those budget estimate submissions in our guidance with the Army, and we are using industry standards in order to do these assessments, both in terms of the cost estimate classification per the American Association of Cost Engineering International, and also current RPs, recommended practices from them, such as the risk neutral project cost using range estimating guidance. Now, this particular guidance brought forward Monte Carlo based cost and schedule risk analysis in order to develop a contingency. That particular RP, as of this month, was revised. It still has a number of different, it provides you other alternatives other than Monte Carlo based use to be able to also develop those estimates and the contingencies. Next slide. Now here, the implications are for that DCA assessment and the contingency is to improve the variation on the project cost estimates. Here, I'm highlighting the ASTM guide. On the left, you'll see in highlighted your upper and lower ranges at a class 3 estimate, which is the goal for the DCA assessments, was much broader and based on here, your typical class 3 estimate. So on left, that class 3 estimate does not include the CSRA, or as defined here, the quantitative risk analysis. For us, it's the CSRA. On the right, using the RP and the review and analysis, you tighten that range. In particular, the low might be, for instance, on the left for the ASTM guide, your low range would be -10 to -30. You tighten that up a little bit on the low range using an 80% confidence level between -10 and -20. But on the high side, you'll see that now we've cut that in half. The high range on the upper was 20 to 60, now it'd be 20 to 30. Now, where do we go with this? The whole purpose is over the next few years that we're able to capture what the results are in all of this and be able to really find out the implications, how effective it is in developing a better PA for the projects and having a better program goal for the all of the projects. Now I can go to questions if you want to right now, or shall I wait, Charisse? Or whomever?
Do we have any questions right now?
Okay.
This is Al. So I have a leading question just so that the audience knows. So in particular on your Army execution slide, what is so important about that July date? What drives that July date?
So for us with that, well, basically we have to review them. We have in our side at headquarters USACE 10 days to review, and then we hand them to the program manager, then works through the senior headquarters USACE and provides them those. We start to rack and stack them to the Army program. So now then they have to go to the Army, and the Army takes a look at the entire array of projects and begins to work through their budget submission and putting them together.
Yes, and that was kind of the point I was hoping you'd drive home. And it's the same for the Air Force and the other services. That July timeframe is the magic date to really nail down the 1391's final costs, and get them ready for the budget, the president's budget.
And our goal right now is 1 September for the budget estimate submission. The hard part about that is we realize then there's a little bit of a delay on that 35%. Hopefully, it depends on how your contracts are written. You also are hopefully soon thereafter, there follows in the late in the year a code 6 or 7 for the design directive to continue to progress, depending on if it's a design build or design bid build.
Yeah, this is Will Daly. I'd like to add that with that timeline, because we're moving, we're moving things kind of to the left. That means that all the releases and the funds available that kind of work through the widgets to us to award a task orders and things like that also have to move to the left, or I mean to match our schedule. And so we have to be the headquarters and leadership needs to understand that to meet the mark and meet the dates that we're going to need the directive. So the last few years we've kind of harped on, hey, we need the funds, we need the authorization as soon as we can, so that we can kind of work with industry and work within our organization to meet the schedule. Over.
And then one other thing is that, well, we are harping on them, like Will said. It's understood, and hopefully that'll have more of an impact going forward. But the biggest thing is that we know OSD has on a couple of projects for a couple of sponsors not move them forward because they didn't meet the requirements that was expected for a 35% design or the class 3 estimate. So sponsors are sensitive to these and do want to see that they have a package that will pass muster. So with that, I'll put it over to Will. Thank you.
So before we move on to Will, I see a question in the chat from Matthew, and it says, this is for Milcon, right? What about FSRM? Is the timeline about the same? How does the process differ between the two?
So SRM doesn't have a DCA assessment or the CSRA. But what can happen, no one says you can't do it, but if you have the money or the funding, and I don't think that that's really there in the program right now to be able to do it, but
yeah,
this is not something that we manage at the Milcon side. That's the SRM installation level.
Right, and I can speak a little bit to it also because that's kind of my job. I used to be deputy base civil engineer as well as I see another individual on here. But what's important about Milcon, it is line item project approval by Congress. It goes into the budget by line item. And FSRM is 1 year money. Milcon money is a 5-year appropriation. And FSRM comes in one single line slug and the service is divided up accordingly so that you don't have the rigid approval processes. Now, is it smart to try to follow that same business process as you're doing an FSRM project on a smaller scale? It probably is.
Yeah, it could be beneficial to the project if you're really trying to assure that you have, if it's more complicated, right? There might be more issues, understanding it better and being able to put together a better budget. We've already broken the case here now in the Milcon where it's accepted. So that in changing we all know that we're bound by the facility codes and what's in there for guidance unit cost. This is one tool that's available to you to be able to change that and inform a better project cost estimate. Over.
All right. And one other question from Timothy. And he's stating, just confirming that P80 is the directive and not P50 for the results
No,
derived in the CSRA and the Class 3 deliverable.
so the reason this is the P80 right now on this is because that came from the PR that we have, the recommended practice. The Army is using P50, the risk neutral estimate. So that's the Army guidance and the Army alone. Any project sponsor can choose another P, probability or confidence level. And we have had, and I was doing them last year, I was doing all the reviews. We did have some sponsors that were using the P80. I'm not a part of that decision-making piece, but I do know that they did do that and it was awarded. Over.
Yeah, so this is Will. William Daly. I'm the cost lead for Europe District here in Wiesbaden. Small intro. We could probably go to the next slide. Yeah, so we were talking about risk neutral estimates. It's kind of a nice segue. The risk neutral estimate as like the definition and as it's referenced in the USD Lord memo is the 50% confidence level calculated using Monte Carlo. And so that's kind of where we're at for the Army's program is the 50% to meet the this definition. The two charts here kind of point out how we looked at it from the UFC 3-730-01, which is for MILCON cost estimating, where we looked at 5% construction contingency, and then other contingencies were not so finalized or broke out. So this delta is really what we're trying to define here. And as you can see in industry to the right, industry guidance is not considering these flat rates. So we kind of have a lot of flat rates, and if anybody's looked at a 1391 or dealt in this business, is we have a lot of rates that are kind of dictated to us, S&A and contingency, for example. And so we're trying to get away from that. So it's and again, this is a learning thing. This will be the second year running cost and schedule risk analysis on MILCONs, and so we're really trying to hone in on contingency, all categories of contingency. But for most people that see a 1391, they kind of think of construction contingency that's below the line, and then everything else. So it's kind of a learning phase for us. But we're really trying to identify risks. For once, we typically in the past, where's the design contingency? How we capture design contingency? Do we have a conversation about contingency at all? Might not have a conversation about that at all. Might follow kind of the cookbook 3-730-01, which you start with the guidance unit costs and you add a factor, add a factor, add a factor, add a factor, and then you get a number. And so that we're trying to get away from that. And that kind of also plays into the code 35% design, because we have some, we have a more developed design. We have something that we can actually do a cost and schedule risk analysis. We can have a workshop. We can talk about it. We have the detail versus the old way. We have PDRs and we're in the parametric world. So I think that's all I have to say about that. Next slide. So again, this is CSRA process. Folks that have worked in support of the Corps are very familiar in the Civil Works program. So a lot of it's, we're stealing, borrowing, copying from a lot of process that's been ongoing in the Civil Works side of the Corps of Engineers for a very long time. But we're trying to kind of package that in a way that it fits the MILCON's process. and a facility, a one facility scenario. Risk analysis is a very broad discussion. It typically is applied to big, large scope projects like the Big Dig in Boston or the reconstruction of New Orleans. But we're trying to kind of put it into a way that we can do it for one building. And this is just kind of bullet points of kind of things that we think about and how it progresses from the risk registry, how there's a brainstorming conversation, how we talk about each risk, and maybe we give it a range, maybe we don't model it. And again, this is the second year doing it, so we're learning. We're working with consultants. A lot of the consultants are hiring and other consultants that specialize in risk and risk facilitation, which has been a great experience, a huge learning experience for our staff here at Europe District, and as well as the consultants working with us, because I think often we don't apply a risk analysis, a broader defined risk analysis on a set building per se, as we are here, and so it's just different. And so in the end, we come up with an S-curve, of course, and we have contingency tables in our sensitivity charts. And a lot of it's the identification of risk, tracking the risk, mitigating it. That's that bullet point about risk mitigation. In theory, it's a living document, right? It can be populated at the time of the workshop and then maintained in the future. In the scenario we're showing you here, we are running it, the one time at code 2, and but it does not hold back anybody from taking it further. Either the AE using it, or us in-house using it, or a program manager, or anybody using it. But it's more formalized. I think in risk and in contingency in the past, we were all about kind of go-bys and what we did in the past, or here's a range, and this is this is formalizing it. This is honing the people that we support and work for, gives them a report that they can see, they can understand what risks were modeled, and all the backup that goes along with those risks. So yeah, that's it. Next slide. So this is kind of an image of the risk registry, for example. It's broken into different categories. We spend time on project management. We set time on contract acquisition. And so this is just an example of a risk registry. It's a template that we include in our guidance, and then we also make it available to the consultants, as well as whoever needs to do formalized risk analysis. This risk template is the standard. It's developed by the Corps of Engineers in-house. And so you see the likelihoods, you see the ranges, you see the color coding of the cost and the schedule impacts. So yeah, you have risk considered, likelihood, and distribution variance. So we're choosing it. You can see it's all triangular distributions here in this kind of example. And so, yeah, even there's an example about subcontractor resources, and how would we formalize that risk or model that risk is kind of the conversation that goes on during the workshop. During the workshop, this PDT discussions column, it's really little text, but where there's the most text in the column is where somebody, the person facilitating it, and then their support staff is writing real time input from the whole team. And this is really critical. This is documenting the workshop in the best way that we can see, that we've seen so far. This then, of course, this big spreadsheet is then summarized in the report. and then customer stakeholders, it focuses them on the risks that were modeled. And then we have like a tornado chart. But yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, this is again the categories that we were talking about when we're developing the risk registry. So you can see it's kind of the whole gambit of different categories. You can always add categories. There's definitely overlap. There's a tremendous amount of touch points, especially when we're in different stakeholders. And over here specifically, we're in different countries with different ministries of defense, and MOUs and MOAs are not even inked, or there's not enough detail to make to make decisions. And so the gambit of conversations that go on this on an overseas stage is pretty broad. Everything from permitting to everything. So this is just another slide honing in on that. And then it shows the triangular distribution, uniform distribution, and as well as that little impact of consequences of occurrence. It's kind of like a little heat map, likelihood of occurrence. That's another risk matrix chart that comes with the template. And it's, again, these are the standard charts. Every risk registry and spreadsheet looks the same. We try to maintain consistency as much as we can. Next slide. So again, this is some more charts, lots of charts. So we're the tornado chart there at the top, which I'm probably not even say it correctly, but tornado chart. But that sensitivity, cost, risk, that one's always grabs people's eyes. It has each risk that we modeled, and then kind of the range. It's very powerful chart to communicate, as well as the contingency table, which we're trying to capture, let's say, the sliding scale of the program amount. The result of the risk analysis results in a sliding scale. The PA that we're targeting for risk neutral would be 50% there. So you can see it's 10% contingency, and the results, it says contract cost, but we can say PA. That's really what we're trying to relay and communicate. And I think here we talk about, we don't want to water it down with too many risks. That's always a key thing, is we want to get in a good facilitator. A risk facilitator is key here, that we don't want to spend too much time. Often when we get a risk registry, when we've first populated it, it just depends on the group that that is involved in developing the risk registry. Some of them will go ahead and just use the standard template, and then just kind of fill in things. Others will be very verbose and talk about all kinds of risk. So you got to find a happy medium. And then when you're doing the actual workshop, you got to focus the team on the risks that are going to have the highest impact. So then we go back down to the S curves, which is the one there down in the bottom, and you can see that the output as like the sliding scale of the probability and then the contingency. Here it says revisit at process stage gates. Yeah, that would be always recommended. But for the exercise of code 2 and 35% validation, we are doing it one time. But I've looked back at the old ones that we've done last year many times to support conversations and from a technical perspective. So that's it for that slide. Next slide. Yep. So this is the most important contingency table. It's also found now in the ENT 6196, which is the DCA assessment form. It's kind of a snapshot of the level of confidence as well as the resulting PA, I could say contract costs. And so again, it's the Lord memo that's driving most this requirement for risk neutral estimates. And then the Monte Carlo simulation allows us to run the variability against the distribution for each one of the risks that we've chose to model. And then again, highlighting that project sponsor can always choose higher confidence. I know that last year SOCOM chose to 80% or even 100% on a few projects. That's their prerogative, and they adjusted their funds request accordingly. So next slide. And this is in summary. Again, it's just reiterating what I've covered so far. I don't think I have anything else to add. Next slide.
Hey, Will, this is Patty. I just wanted to add on to it. If you could go back a slide for just 2 seconds. Overall, what we're trying to say is that we're trying to capture this complete contingency. Because what happened before was you only had that 5%. So if you see where that red dot is and above, that's about all the contingency we're capturing with just saying the 5%. Realizing that true contingency and evaluating it using a qualitative risk process helps us to capture a greater portion of that. And through the OSD memo, the Lord, we have the opportunity to inform them better. And that's the intent and purpose here. Thanks. Oh, and one other thing, we know the 1391 and the PAC system and everything is very rudimentary and still has the 5%. How we apply that is we go back and we alter the facility dollar per unit cost. And so that's what we're having to do at the moment. But hopefully the process proves fruitful and then we can change some of that over.
Thanks for bringing that up, Patty. That was going to be my question, is how you compensate for that on 1391. So we have one question in the chat from Matthew again. In case I missed it, sorry. How long has this process been active? And are you seeing the benefits of this process when comparing the result to the true cost of the Milcom project once completed?
Yeah, so this is now the 3rd year of the program under the USD Lord memo. The first year was just to do the assessments as to where they were in terms of a classification of the estimate. We're still doing that through. Last year was to do the DCA assessments on those over 20 million and a CSRA on over 40. So as you can see, it's been a phased process. This year, we're in the complete program now. I probably should add that slide, where now we're putting it into the DCA assessments and the project definition deliverable and cost estimate classification is done on every Milcom estimate, or pardon me, every Milcom project submitted for the budget estimate submission, and a CSRA cost estimate on everything over 20 million, and that will continue forward. And we haven't seen the benefits of this yet because we're only just starting. Last year was the first year you were doing the CSRA and putting that into process. So as you know, they're only now into design, not awarded. So not quite there to be able to tell how that will play out. I'll tell you, I did it a while ago and put it through the system on a project, and it did help my project get the right budget submission. But that was like one of those, you know, we started doing them on our own sometimes when we had a sponsor who was willing.
Okay, we have one more question from John. How does historical projects of similar scope scale factor into the contingency development? Organized award amount, including mods, claims, REAs, et cetera.
I'm not sure if I can, maybe Will might want to try to take a stab at this, but I'll answer first. hopefully during your risk analysis and you're assessing and going through it, you're taking some of your historical knowledge that you might have or others in doing a review and being able to include that on your risk analysis when you're putting together your table. That's how it would factor into some of the continued development. We don't have that right now as a part of our historical 1391 PACS processing guidance unit cost stuff. So I'm talking probably too many acronyms. I'm trying not to, but that hadn't been included. So if you're talking about final costs to complete, maybe that's what you're getting at, that hadn't been factored. And that's what we're trying to do also. So FYI, a little bit of bigger program, bigger picture things. We're beginning to take a look at also, and there is a push to get what the actual program at completion cost is. So now hopefully we can begin. This is going to take a long process, right? To change, we're trying to move an elephant and say, okay, now we have to measure things. So there is an effort to say, well, we started at it, where we are at the 35 award and then completion. But it's not there yet, and the system isn't built at the moment. So yes, we are trying and identified that. Over.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that got to kind of remember too that we're doing this at the 35% design milestone. So we've had a design review meeting where we're adjudicating, hundreds of comments on the design. So we're going to do the back check, and then we're doing that kind of at the same time. It's kind of a parallel effort. We're also doing a VE study, so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts there. But at this point, you're taking account all kinds of categories. Like you're focused on construction mods. Another guy in the group is going to talk about how he's really concerned about acquisition risk. What kind of mechanism, or what kind of contract are we using? So everybody's risk is going to be, or what they bring to the conversation is going to be a little different. So the facilitator is, there to get the whole team kind of focused and press on. So over.
Yeah, and it gets everyone to think. So you're working together, and it might prompt other items. But just because you identify it and you're putting it into your risk register, doesn't mean that you model everything that's there. You model the ones that are important. But sometimes in that facilitation, you're able to identify other factors that you really truly might not have identified individually. So.
All right, thank you. Those all great comments. If you don't mind, we can press on a little bit. We have a lot of case studies to get through, and we can backtrack on additional questions on the cost and scope risk analysis. So our first case study up is on risk management by CDM Smith. I believe Jeff is on the line, so I will turn it over to him.
Hey, Al, this is Sharice and Jeff. I have your other slides in here. I didn't know whether you wanted to run through those quickly and then do your case study, or if we should just jump to the case study. And this is
I would like to get, if you don't mind, I was asked to give a kind of an industry perspective on risk management. This is and then it finishes up basically with my case study. So
okay.
This is a briefing, what you see here, that we gave to Will Daly and our PM, Erasmo Rivera, at the Corps, when we were doing a CSRA for project at Grafenwehr. My name is Jeff Pitchford. I'm from CDM Smith, and we are a little bit unique in that as an AE firm, we're also a construction firm. And so we do a lot of risk analysis, including having done a lot of risk analysis for civil works projects for the Corps of Engineers all over the world. So we'd like to think that we brought some value to the process as they began to do CSRAs for MilCon for the Europe district, and a district we've done work in for quite a while. If you go to the next slide, these are the next slide, please. These are the things that that I'll briefly touch on. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the intent here is to kind of take the charts that Will just went through and talk about how industry views this whole process, what risk is, how we determine it when we do risk analysis on projects that we have to live with. I mean, when CDM Smith does one, we're, as a design builder, we live directly profit and loss wise on how well we do this. And so, you know, how we determine the probabilities and develop that risk matrix and use it, and most importantly, manage it, goes directly to how well we do. And we can transfer that to the perspective of an organization like the Corps of Engineers. It's maybe a little different kind of risk and perspective on risk, but it's very similar to what you're looking to do. So next slide, please. What is risk? Basically, the way we look at it is it's what we know and what we don't know. And we'd spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we know and what we don't know, because that's where risk lies. It lies in the gap between what you know and what you don't know, and the different possibilities that grow out of trying to fill that gap, trying to understand how you get from the unknown to the known. And what a lot of folks don't necessarily concentrate on, and in fact many don't understand, is risk can be both positive and negative. There can be an opportunity that you were not aware of before that can rise out of the filling that gap in between the known and the unknown, and the positive risk is something that you shouldn't be set aside and not considered when you getting into the full analysis of what you're doing. And negative risks, of course, are those threats, those things that we have to do something about, we want to make sure that we try to minimize as we move along. And in this, okay. In this instance, what we have to do is take a look at what we're going to do along the entire life cycle of the project to try to keep the risks at a minimum and from an industry perspective, we turn that contingency into profit. And from a Corps of Engineers perspective, you can turn that contingency into money to be used on projects, moving it from one project to another, to where you can cover that zero-sum base of MILCON. You know, you only get a certain amount for each one. You got to move it between them if you have one that goes over and one that stays down, stays down below. And that's really the most significant tool. Next. How do you determine risk? We start off just by brainstorming as a team in a big way, and then do a very extreme market analysis on larger projects. But we do it on smaller ones as well, because you need to know where you're at. I'll give you an example here. We have projects in Brussels, Luxembourg, and Germany. They all touch each other, right? But it's a very different market in each of those those two little areas, Brussels and Luxembourg, as opposed to Germany. Contractors cross, but the different laws, there's different capability within each one. And so you could take the same project and put it in any of those three countries, and it's an extremely different CSRA will result from that. An extremely different list of things will come up. We do a lot of discussion with stakeholders. If it's in Germany, we talk, you're talking to the Bauamt a lot. We, visit the local fire folks and all of those things to see what's coming up. And it's really important to do that. because it changes a lot. And especially in each country being a little bit different, it changes a lot. We take a look at recent projects. We have a lot of them, and we see what's happened on those, and our local partners help us out to take a look at recent projects that are there and determine the kinds of things that are possible to have happen, from labor market issues to supply issues to regulatory issues, all of them. And then we do that consultation with the local authorities. That is really, really vital, because in the end, you have to keep up with where they're going, and they move around quite a bit. So this is how you get the list, basically. Next slide. The probabilities, this is the most important part, because as you begin to put this in here, this is what goes into all those S curves and models that Will was showing you. And we do that by taking those recent case studies and all those consultations. We do direct estimates on the cost of some of these things. What will be the cost? We spend the time to do that. Again, in the industry side of this thing, that's profit and loss. It's how we're going to end up staying in business. And then we run a lot of simulations, and we have a whole group of folks within our company that do that kind of thing, and so that we can really hone in on what the impact of these things are going to be. This is the most important step. This is the one where you have to spend a lot of time. Next one. When you put together the risk matrix that they showed you, we list them all. We don't care if they're a high probability or a low probability. We list them all, and the reason is we want to see the full picture. And yes, that results in a pretty big, an extensive spreadsheet. However, you can always take them off, but because what we have found is some of the ones we think start off as low end up growing, and we start inserting those in after we have a workshop that goes over each one of them to get consensus on where, which ones stay, which ones go, how we end up defining it. This is a process. This is a very extensive process, and on a smaller project, you're probably not going to do a ton of that, but on a larger project, this is vital. To spend the time to bring the entire team in and to do a real evaluation as you put all of these things on the risk matrix, because that becomes the tool that you begin to work with. And if you use it well, it is an enormous benefit. Next. So managing risk, we concentrate on mitigation, and Will talked about mitigation in his part, and the Corps generally focuses on mitigation. But as a private contractor, those first two are decisions we make every day. Do we either accept it as just a risk that's worth taking, or do we just avoid it and not bid the job? And that's something that has to be looked at when you're planning the job. And it's important in my opinion, from the Corps perspective, to do everything they can to reduce the risk on a package before it even goes out onto the street, because risk equals contingency in a bid. We all know that, right? And the riskier of a project you put on the street, the higher your bids are going to be, no matter how much planning you do up front. Because the contractor, if he's going to not accept it and he's not going to avoid it, they're going to put money into their profit line, into their contingency line, to be able to cover it. And we take action to mitigate all the time, and this is the important part. This is something that when you're looking at the entire life cycle of the project, you do during the design process. You try to mitigate as much of that risk so you avoid getting that large contingency on a project if you can. And this is something that we try to do as an AE provider all the time. We make suggestions on how to reduce that risk by designing something maybe a little bit differently, and making sure that we do something. And the last thing is you can transfer it. Most of that is through contract language, but you can move that risk on to someone else. That's hard for that's the hardest one to do, but it is definitely something that is considered all the time by a contractor when they're looking at your packages that come out onto the street. When you do the mitigation action, has to be specific though, and it has to be measurable and actionable. You can come up with this nice list, but if you can't, if that's not something very specific that you can do, it's not worth anything. It's just something on a risk matrix that takes up space. And the important part to remember about risk is they change over time. They have a life, and they eventually die, and they go away because they've been overcome by events. In other words, whatever was causing the risk has now passed. And it's really important as you move along and you manage risk. Go to the next slide, please, and then I'll get into why that matters. So why do you use that matrix? When I'm talking about managing the risk, it allows you to, if you review it on a regular basis, it allows you to take some timely action. If you're a Milcom manager at the Corps of Engineers, it might give you an opportunity to move that money to another project. It helps you, of course, we all talked about already, determining contingency on a project so you're covered. But at the same time, you can maybe release funds to go to another job, or in the case of the private contractor, we might release it to the profit line or that kind of thing at a time when that we know that risk is passed. But if you just do the risk matrix and set it aside after it's not up front, you're not using it to its full potential. It really is a management tool that, if reviewed on a very regular basis, can allow you to make some decisions to further reduce risk on related risk lines, move money around to other places where risk exists when it no longer exists on that project, and do the kinds of things that makes you able to make the maximum use out of all the funds that you have, and to continue to improve the project as you move along. Next. Now, how do we manage it? We basically, these are the things that we go through. I'm not going to spend much time on this. You have to go beyond identify and evaluate. You have to track it. You have to revisit it. You have to continue to take action to reduce it, because it's going to become apparent to you as the project moves along that you're going to have opportunities to do that. And then when you get to the point where that risk is now dead, you release and you move on to the next one, and you focus on the next one, and it allows you to focus those efforts. So it's something that you can't set aside. You have to keep going through this entire life cycle of what I call the life cycle of risk here, and continue to look at it and look at it and look at it. It's not just something up front. If you use this thing fully, it's not just something up front to determine an initial budget. Next. All right, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides. This is the draft summary that we gave on our Graphenwehr project, and then I'll give you a little bit of background on the Graphenwehr when I get there. Go ahead, you can move on. This is the summary that we gave them. This was our initial CSRA. You can look at it at a very high level. Go to the next slide. And this is both cost and schedule. We used the risk register that Will provided us. It's very similar to what we use in our private on our private jobs, and so we were able to go through, identify a bunch of risks for them, categorize them, those kind of things in the format that they wanted. Next slide. And you can summarize it by different categories. Okay, the risk categories that you see, who owns the risk, this is a very powerful tool to know where you need to focus your effort to be able to work with that particular agency to do the things that are necessary to mitigate or transfer or do those things that I talked about before to try to focus your efforts on where the most important, with the most important folks that you need to deal with. Next. Again, in this case, it's by the different agencies that were involved. We identified the different agencies and stakeholders along the top, and the different folks that own the risk along the side there, and you can see where you need to spend the time and who needs to be engaged at the various stages. Next slide. And then this is basically by each type of risk where the risk lies in terms of cost and schedule, and or both. And so you can look at it that way. Next slide. And then basically by cost impact, the negligible, the marginal, the moderate, the significant, and the critical. And you can see where the drivers are. We didn't take any off. There were a lot of down in the negligible and marginal range, but we identified some that were quite significant. So you know where to go in terms of spending your time. Next. But all of this fed into the model, by the way, whether they were negligible or marginal anyway. And then this is the same thing on schedule. And we didn't identify any critical ones, but we identified some fairly moderate and significant ones that had to be looked at. Next. Before I go into specifics, a little bit of specifics on Grafenwehr, does anybody have any questions? Okay. The important part of this.
I see none in the chat, so please press on. Thank you.
Okay. The important part of all of that is that from an industry perspective, the contractor is looking for the Corps of Engineers to put out projects where they have, if they have looked at risks like this, where they have taken action to reduce it to the contractor. That gets you your better price. Next. All right, the project that we did the CSRA for is a large project at Grafenwehr in Germany for an ORTC, Operation Readiness Training Complex. The first two phases of a 7-phase complex with dining facility, fitness facility, 4 large barracks, a couple of company officer facilities for their housing, 2 company operations facilities, a couple of brigade and battalion facilities, vehicle maintenance, and large parking areas. This entire project, these 2 phases, is in the neighborhood of $300 million, and it's a full site development of what's currently forested areas. So there were a lot of risks that came along with dealing with the specifics of taking that many trees down in that kind of a market in that area. So it was a challenging risk assessment to do. Next slide, please. We started off by doing the brainstorming as a team, and we did a local market of what those risks could be, and we identified several, and a lot of them came out of the local market analysis. Grafenwehr is in an area where it's not near a very large metropolitan area at all. And so a lot of what we identified as risk had to do with labor availability in the area and material availability in the area, and the risk of having to bring all that stuff in for a project that they just generally don't see the size of in that labor market. $300 million in Grafenwehr is quite a bit. So we held some long discussions with the folks from the DPW there and from with Will and Erasmo at the Corps of Engineers and folks in from the BAU to determine what specifically in that area were going to be the big issues. And it came down to some very unique local Bavarian regulations and local labor issues, as I mentioned, and those became the ones that stood out on the risk matrix that I showed you earlier. It's really important in the European market to recognize that it varies significantly depending on where you're at. I mean, if I would have done the same risk analysis for the project and put this project in Belgium, for instance, those risks wouldn't be present because it's a much different market and very, very different rules in terms of environment. So you really have to know local the local market conditions where you're working, and that's what we spent most of our time on, is understanding that local installation and understanding the market in that local installation. And we took a look, along with our local design partners, took a look at similar projects that in terms of construction type, and that resulted in identifying some risks that were unique to the Grafenwehr area. And then we have permitting agency and the local governments there have some very unique rules, and we, in consultation also with our local partners and the local authorities, identified some very significant risks in terms of being able to take all those trees down, what time of year they could be taken, what would happen if that was delayed in any way. And those things were quite significant. Next slide. The probabilities, we spent, this is where we spent most of our time, and that because this is what determines the ones you really want to spend your time on, as I said before. And most of this was done by taking a look at recent projects and seeing, what happened on those, and that's very useful in what you're trying to accomplish in terms of understanding recent history. And this is particularly important, this part of it, in the current market, because it's changing so fast. When you consider COVID and supply chain issues and all of those things that are happening basically everywhere right now, this is a really important part of putting the probabilities together. We continued those consultations with the local experts and our local consultants, AE firms that we work with, and we did actually reach out and do some estimating with local suppliers, vendors, and subcontractors on the more significant equipment that was coming in. We literally went out and we got some quotes, so we understood better what the magnitude of that would be. And then we ran simulations, not on the full thing. I mean, eventually it gets run on the full risk matrix, but we actually ran internally some simulation just on the more important items. We did separate spreadsheets and ran simulation on just the most important items. Again, on a $300 million project, we're gonna do that. Probably not on a single project, a smaller project, but we're gonna do it on a bigger project. Next. We went through this process just as I talked about before, and we were able to adjust some of what we were designing to mitigate some of the risks that we were talking about. We changed some things. We changed some things that we were putting into the RFP that was going over to the bottom based upon the CSRA. We adjusted some of the mechanical stuff. We adjusted some of the ways we were handling stormwater, those kind of things. So this process led directly to some design changes that reduced the risks to the contractor that were not on when this project went over to the bottom. And we know that happened because it was a collective effort that included those folks. And you put all that together. And if you do the CSRA at the right time, you can take that action and reduce the overall risk to the Corps of Engineers as they put it out, and contractors are looking at it and not identifying as many gaps in what they see, and looking at it and saying, well, they must have considered that labor was short here, and we're going to do it this construction method as opposed to that construction method because of the fact of where it's being built and what the labor market is like there. You can make it. This is really important. As a design builder, CDM Smith does this all the time. We adjust the methods we use based on the market we're in to lower cost. Next. All right, are there any questions for me before I'm finished?
Yes, so we have a question from Charisse. Can you highlight how you manage risk associated with Corona in terms of time delay and or costing? Would it be a contractual mitigation with penalties?
I would. What we have done on our private side, when we're working with other agencies, is we've written into contracts the very specific items that need to be followed when they're, as far as managing the site goes, and that's what it really comes down to. But you have to accept the fact, and we do accept the fact, that it's going to lengthen the period of performance a bit. They not only right on site, but in what we're seeing in terms of the length of time that it's taking for deliveries, manufacturing time. Right now it is literally touching every aspect along the chain that gets the material to the site and gets it installed. So from my perspective, when we are acting as construction manager, whether it's for ourselves or we're a consultant on someone else's project, we have advocated for longer periods of performance right now, and that's just something that we have come to understand that we have to accept, because it's of no fault to the contractor whatsoever. They can't control how long it's going to take for them to get that HVAC equipment. There's just so many factors out there right now that are outside their control, and it really is not something that we feel we could go in front of a judge and ever put on them and have them stand up to, where we could say that yes, that's their fault and completely their fault. So you have to accept that.
Right. Okay.
It takes longer period of performance.
Right. Okay. And I think in part, on the second part of the question, would it be a contractual mitigation with penalties? I see John Butala put in, it looks like a FAR reference on default fixed price construction. If you want to take a minute and just explain what you mean by that, please come up on the net, John. I think.
Sorry,
John,
turn my mic off. So turn my mic
okay.
off. This is the FAR reference that we experience as the contractor on the contractor side for this particular impact, COVID related, the pandemic. It's as we were just talking about here, it's through no fault, time extensions. What the challenge then becomes is how do you find relief for it? in the context of cost. There's costs associated with that, but the government in its sovereign capacity will then reflect this as acts of God, and that becomes the challenge when you have these FAR provisions that you have to deal with contractually, and this is this fits to that scenario. So that was because the reference then is it's reflected in all contracts, and these are part of our flow down provisions. We're aware of that. That's typically how it's dealt with, how it has been dealt with for the last 2-3 years, and it can be quite challenging. I mean, because what we get then is we get no cost time extensions, but we still have to then deal with all the other cost related impacts associated with this, and then how to handle that contractually is, I think, literally the long pole in the tent at this moment.
From a private industry standpoint, we've had these discussions as on our construction side, and it's going to be very difficult for anybody to come to a contractor and say that delay is completely your fault. You could have controlled that, and as a result, you should get a penalty. That's going to be really hard to do because so many things are just not within the control of the contractor in any way at all. And so we're worried about this part. As the gentleman said, this is going to take a little bit of a life of its own, I think, and it's going to be very difficult to wade through.
So this, and that's why Sammy likes to do industry and government engagement forums. So these types of issues can be brought up in other venues and tackled and concentrated on. So maybe this one is one worth looking at for a future event.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I see no more questions. I'm looking at the time here, and we're definitely not going to make it in an hour and a half. So the goal right now is to do a hard stop at 5 p.m. our time, which is about 40 minutes from now. We have 3 more case study presenters, and so please just be wary of your time. This has all been great discussion so far. And anyway, I'll pass it off to Ecom Tuna.
All right, I'll go quick. Good morning for the ones in the US and good afternoon for the ones in Europe. I'm Tuna Tanriover. I'm the director of ACOM's risk group in the US. Our team provides risk assessment and risk management services across the world and has conducted CSRA services for Army Corps of Engineers for tens of projects. Today I will go one of them. Next slide. Rhein-Ordens Barracks Medical Center is a €1 billion state-of-the-art hospital project currently being built near the Rhein-Main Air Base in southwest Frankfurt, Germany. Once complete, it will replace the US military's largest overseas hospital, Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. At the beginning of this year, the notice to proceed was given to the main contractor, and the project is expected to be completed by the end of 2027. Next slide. The project to date had several challenges to overcome. For example, it was not easy to comply both German and US design and building codes at the same time. In addition, there were significant changes to the anti-terrorism and Germany energy and sustainability regulations resulted in design delays. A saturated construction market in Germany, as well as lack of competition, end up increasing the project budget materially. And finally, the more stakeholders you have, the harder to make timely decisions. And this project has many stakeholders. Next slide. For this project, our team was tasked to perform CSRA services at 35% and then updated at 65% and 95% design submittals. By following the Corps' robust CSRA guideline, we performed risk interviews with all project participants, including the German government, facilitated in-person risk workshops within the base, and perform quantitative risk analysis for each phase to inform project budgeting and management. Next slide. While we were performing the CSRA, there were a few challenges to estimate and manage the design and construction risks. So these challenges are not only specific to this project, but also typical in all other core projects as well. So first one is it's important to develop a good understanding among the project personnel of what the CSRA process is, why we perform it, and where it's used. This hopefully increase the engagement from the project personnel, also eliminate any potential positive or negative biases on the risks that the participants may have. Secondly, a well-developed schedule is as crucial as the cost estimate for CSRA. Our experience in many other core projects is that the schedule does not advance until later stages of the design phase. Many times we had to develop our own schedule and make revisions to the schedule logic. And for this project in Germany, it's a program that has many contracts, so it was even more complicated. Finally, CSRA itself is mainly focused on performing of the risk analysis and leave the project with mitigation recommendations. In order to increase the chance of success in a project, more emphasis can be given the implementation of mitigation strategies. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Tuna. I know that was rather quick. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we'll press on. Black and Veatch, Mr. Kevin Harder.
Thanks. In the spirit of keeping it going, I'll do the same pretty much. It'll be fairly quick. My name is Kevin Harder. I'm with Black and Veatch. I'm a program director and also moonlight as a project manager on some select projects. We've designed numerous secure facilities and many of them in Europe. And we're now using the CSRA to continue focusing on the risks and mitigations that would impact the project costs. As noted before, now the step process is right after the 35% design. And as Will noted, it's I say pretty hectic because you'll have VE study going on, you have design review meetings going on, and then you'll have the CSRA going on all at the same time because we got to meet that obviously July 1 milestone. So is what I'm going to talk about is just maybe something more unique for secure facilities. It's not on a particular project, it's just in general. So there's a construction security plan is required for all these secure facilities. So that sets parameters for the general contractor and specialized contractors for the execution of the project. USpace does have a pool of consultants and contractors that exclusively develop these CSPs to help with consistency. The second item, again, is procurement protocols. That's within the CSP. It's where can we get materials and equipment? Are there some excluded countries that we can't? Is something required to come from the United States? So obviously that impact would be cost and schedule for transportation, either by air or water. So you have to factor that in your risks, and especially due to COVID and all the delays, that the schedule is going to be impacted. Also, not a requirement in the CSP, but one of the things that the CSP does require is obviously inspections, and it's a little longer process to get through. So really for concrete, you should look at it. Should it be an on-site batch plant or a concrete mix plant? If you're bringing it in off base, you have to go through the initial access control point and then go through another point for inspection. So it just takes a longer time. So there might be a benefit to have on-site batch plant. Then there's a secured storage laydown area. That's obviously required, fenced, all the electronic surveillance and everything on those areas. So I guess there's an access control facility for that. And then also if you're removed from your particular, if your project is a little bit away from that SSLA, then there might be access control facility at your location of your site to get in through that area. So it's one of the paramount things is to try to find where that site could be, and again, that should be in coordination with the CSP. And it could be a greenfield site, which is going to cost a little bit more, or there might be some existing locations that can be identified, so we could use some of the existing infrastructure for that. So again, that the location of that SSLA really does drive costs. And then the last item is, again, due to the nature of secure facilities, there's going to be more security. So the specialized inspectors and guards that's noted in the CSP, there might be something like the ratio of guards per construction employees. So again, that drives costs. And so the CSP basically provides the specifics and roles and responsibilities for these security personnel. So again, at the bottom of the slide, so the risks are dependent upon maturity of these considerations and parameters at the time of the CSRA development. So obviously, the farther along, the less risk that would be applied in the CSRA. But also, I guess just in summary, Black & Veatch's experience with the CSRA kind of, maybe this will pull together some of the other discussions as far as kind of how we see it is really getting everybody together as a team at the very beginning and discussing the risk and running through the risk register, as Will had noted, is obviously a vital component. And then they would go away, develop a draft, or we'd go away, develop a draft, and then come back and then discuss that draft with the same team and adjust risk or mitigations as we go forward, and then develop a final CSRA. Also, as kind of mentioned just on the previous couple of presenters, the application of real world events on how the cost could be affected with inflation, workforce availability, obviously to try to get sourcing of localized pricing for the labor, materials, and equipment. And then just having some understanding of the construction processes in the EU. And then again, the CSP for a secure project is vital and is a cost driver. And as Will mentioned before, was the acquisition strategy. What is the acquisition strategy? So all this is being discussed in the CSRA development, because different acquisition strategies are going to be provide us with different risks. And then probably the last thing, again, unique to a secure facility project, is possible schedule impacts due to the vetting of the CSP personnel, so the inspectors and the guards that would need to be vetted. There is a lead time at the beginning of the project that needs to be accounted for in the scheduling. So that was all I had.
So I have a question. I have a question for you, Kevin. So listening to all the presenters, a thought just hit me. At least on the Air Force side, as we develop a project, before we put it on a 1391, there's some sort of a planning charrette process. Do you see any value of having cost and schedule risk analysis as part of a planning charrette, or at the end of a planning charrette after you've discussed requirements?
I'm not sure I would go that far. I think you probably really need to get into that design phase and look at it a little bit harder with the design disciplines. And I think you're going to get a really good product, because those designers are going to have insight, because they're trying to figure out where the equipment, what the equipment's going to. What equipment that's actually needed. Obviously, the planning charrette has identified equipment and everything. So
yeah, as you discussed each of the work elements and the different disciplines.
Yeah.
This is Jeff Pitchford from CDM Smith again. If you don't mind, I would I think the perfect time to do it is in association with the 35% review conference. Because you have enough there, you haven't gotten too far down the line, and it gives you an opportunity to react to the risk in your design. So if I had a vote, that's where it would be.
Yeah, I concur. Yeah, it's a good spot. We haven't got that far along. We can pivot on some items to mitigate the risk.
All right, very good. Thank you. One question from Patty. Do you think this could be incorporated with the VE effort, value engineering?
I guess I'll throw that out to others.
This is Jeff Fishford again. I hate to keep jumping in, but yes, absolutely. It's a perfect combination with VE because you're looking at, you're bringing a little bit more to the VE effort. You're bringing the risk in evaluating the VE opportunities that you have. And so what I like to do is, and because it's kind of the opportunity to completely reset your design of direction, is to do the 35% review conference, the VE and the CSRA as kind of a combined effort. To be able to look at all of those options and all of those opportunities that you have to improve your design. So it's a great combination with VE.
Yeah, on our projects that we've done, the VE study was done just before, so we had some of that insight when we were doing the CSRA. So.
Okay, all great input. Thank you. Okay, on to the Gordian presentation. Lisa, are you online?
I am.
All right, great. Welcome.
All right. So we're going to really shift gears here and talk about FSRN and estimating and managing risk within long-term contracts, job order contracts, SABRE contracts, and share a little case study of a work in progress that Gordian has undertaken. I know there was a question earlier in the session about, how the CSRA applies to FSRM projects, and certainly it could apply in an expedited way to very large FSRM. But when it comes to the vast majority of FSRM, the game changes a little bit. You're dealing with this bucket of money. There's not the same visibility on a single project basis, but there is the need to manage and distribute risk and track costs along throughout a long-term contract, typically a 5-year contract. And most importantly, to expedite the execution of work in support of the mission. And that's really what job order contracting was designed to do. If we can go forward one slide, I'm going to start with a really short history lesson, because I bet most of you do not know that job order contracting, which is now the way that most FSRM work gets done in the continental United States, that delivery method was actually created in Europe. In the 1980s, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Mellon, who actually founded the Gordian Group after his retirement, was struggling with all of these problems around small project execution when he was at SHAPE. And he created this unit price based long-term contract partnership to expedite small projects, and then was instrumental in piloting the methodology throughout the DoD in the 80s. And the results were clear, both from some of the early studies of job order contracting in the DoD and more recent studies across not just the DoD and federal government, but other public owners. And job order contracting has really become the standard for at least smaller FSRM project execution. And it's used a lot, OCONUS. And in some ways, the challenge of a limited contractor pool makes job order contracting even more important to those locations. But there's this longstanding challenge of the cost data because our cost data base for DoD is firmly based in North America, as frankly the data assets of Gordian, the RS-Means database, as well as Gordian's other data assets are all developed for the North American market. So this is something that we've been talking to our DoD partners about for a long time and trying to figure out how to solve. We can go forward a slide, and we've in recent years started to dabble in some better ways to tackle OCONUS cost data requirements. And so we did some work in Puerto Rico and the USVI for FEMA, where we did a high resolution database and really started to layer in some contextual costs representing risks around material logistics and productivity. Of course, that's really what I call CONUS derivative. So although it's OCONUS and there are some logistics factors to layer in, you're still dealing with a North American cost basis in terms of materials. We've also done some work to produce costs for the Middle East, specifically our construction task catalog, which is our job order contracting specific, very contractually precise cost data. So we've actually adapted the Tracy's metric data set for job order contracting in 3 Middle East locations using local research. So starting to dabble in adapting costs and developing costs OCONUS. So the project that I'm going to talk about actually emanated, and we can move forward a slide, actually emanated from a need at RAF Lakenheath and Mildenhall. And they really needed to spin up some of their own FSRM execution capacity. They were reliant on host nation vehicles, and there just isn't enough capacity to get the work done, a big backlog of work. They have not had a Sabre in maybe never, certainly not in recent years. And so there was just limited Jock and Sabre experience within CE and contracting. And the way this kicked off was through a simple kind of market research and RFI, where the Air Force was asking, what is the best way to do this? What cost data would we use? And Gordian came to the table and said, we don't have an out-of-the-box solution, but we think that we can help you figure it out. So some of the concerns with spinning up a Sabre in this environment were the alignment of the unit price basis with the building requirements and standards. Obviously, the need for technology enablement anytime you're dealing with large data sets. The familiarity of both the staff and the contractor with not only the cost data, but with the Sabre methodology. How to get the solicitation language right, and then obviously training everyone up. So the solution that we have developed with the Air Force, and we can go to the next slide. We looked at adapting RS-Means data or developing a CTC, but there were actually some good data options within the UK, and we reviewed multiple possibilities and ultimately settled on something called the National Schedule of Rates. And it was chosen really for its auditability and defensibility. Gordian, as a Jock and Sabre expert, did a very extensive engineering review and gap analysis of the data. That informed kind of a go-forward plan for building out some of the data that is missing, but more importantly informed the data governance, the cost data governance within the contract and the solicitation. Gordian has something that we affectionately call the big note, which is a really kind of the rules of the road for using the data. And so understanding where there may be missing items or where the approach in the National Schedule of Rates is different to adapt that big note was really important. And then we integrated the data into our eGordian Jock Sabre workflow system. We also supported a fairly intensive effort around solicitation development. This work kicked off, I think probably last August, and the solicitation was posted maybe a month ago. So it was pretty intensive 6-month process to make sure that we had the solicitation language right, had all of the approvals. What has come out for competition is a $79 million 5-year SABRE contract. We can go to the next slide. Some of the considerations in this planning process were the currency. Started out as a $79 million contract. We actually ended up converting that to pounds because the cost basis is in pounds. So we just aligned everything to that currency. We're looking to reconcile all of the different building standards. Gordian has extensive specifications as a backstop to our programs, and they wanted to leverage those, but we had to establish an order of precedence. And this is a challenge in an IDIQ program where you don't know the scope of the projects. So you have to establish kind of a default order of precedence, and then you have to kind of tackle it on a task order by task order basis. We also helped with seed project configuration, informed the qualifications basis, the source selection criteria. Next slide. And then I can't point to final results. I hope that a year from now we'll be able to point to rapidly stood up execution capacity at Laken Heath and Mildenhall. Right now, our results are a solid solicitation package and in contract language and an open solicitation. So it's still very much a work in process. But we do have a plan to not only update the costs annually, which is so important in a job order contract or a SABRE, to keep up with inflation and spread the risk, adequately assign the risk between the contractor and the owner. But the cost will be updated annually with NSR's commercial cost updates. But we also will be doing a continuous gap analysis and working with NSR to develop and integrate any new line items needed for program execution. And that's through a partnership of Gordian and National Schedule of Rates. We're also providing some intensive on-site support to accelerate that stand-up of the execution capacity. And all of this is this common goal of managing risk for the government and the contractor. Again, a little different than a MILCON estimate. It's managing the risk within a larger bucket of FSRM dollars and trying to make sure that you can get the maximum work done with transparency and flexibility, and most importantly, expedited execution. So, and now we're starting to look at other OCONUS locations. I don't think that integration of local data is the right solution everywhere. I think there are places where the costs are very derivative from North America. We can look at the U.S. territories and maybe even some of the Pacific Rim areas where costs are derivative of U.S. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all, but we really are at Gordian embracing the opportunity to explore OCONUS cost data and how to better serve the U.S. government in its OCONUS execution, costing, estimating, and risk management.
Okay, that's a great rundown. I can speak from personal experience of being at the base level for most of my career, that the JOC and SABRE type tools are, I mean, they're absolutely a necessity for any base civil engineer or DPW or naval facilities public works engineer. Are there any questions? If you do, please post them in the chat. As a reminder, in the chat, you'll see the links to each of the post websites and a link to the PDH certificate. And I think Cherise had posted also, if you need it signed, please just contact her. Okay. Okay, here's a question from Lakenheath. For Ms. Cooley, as for the Sabre contract, how were you able to circumvent having to go through DIO and the 7.5% cost share agreement?
So that is a question that I cannot answer. I think that our the government partner would have to answer. We were engaged with the Air Force, but my understanding is that there was a fairly significant backlog of work to be executed, and they were just looking for another tool. And it's not. I don't think it's replacing the DIO service. It is simply supplementing.
That sounds about right. Any other questions? All right, so first of all, I'd like to thank several people, and I'll probably miss somebody, but at least my observation that the heavy lifters for putting this together were Jen Regal and Charisse and Lisa. And then, of course, Ron at Sami National for attending and help sponsor this event as well. I think it was a great event to have. There's been this kind of a mystery over the cost of schedule risk analysis. It's kind of new to all of us, but I can see some benefit going out in the future myself, especially if we start to catalog and capture lessons learned. And by facility types, the different risks that had been identified as projects go through maturity levels, all different levels of maturity. So anyway, if nobody else has any questions, I'm going to slap the table on this event. I wish everybody a great day or a great evening. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks, everyone.